And what I want to do in my talk is bring those together, bring together the interest in individual level norms and group level norms, because I think one of the big challenges that we've had when talking about animal social norms is a critique that animals lack some basic deontic structures in their cognitive systems, that they lack norms in some more basic way, either concepts or rules or something like that. And so I want to start by going back to this question of norms and how norms are conceptualized by a variety of different researchers who've been working on this topic. So what I have on the slide here is simply a list of different definitions of norms by researchers who are interested largely in norm cognition or social norms and trying to describe the actual practice of social normativity in humans. And as we kind of go through these different definitions, I think that one thing I want to highlight is that what's being referred to is a large number of somewhat overlapping classes of practices and cognitive capacities. And so what we take away from this is that there might not be broad agreement about what the explanandum is when we're asking questions about whether or not animals have norms, or even if we're just asking whether animals have social norms. So in one of the classic papers on the structure of norm cognition in humans, Sripada and Stitch write that a norm is a rule or principle that specifies actions which are required, permissible, or forbidden independently of any legal or social institution. And this focus on rules you also see in Southwood and Erickson's work on social norms, that there are particular rules or requirements that are widely accepted within particular social groups. And Christina Bicchiari, on her account, also stresses rules. The social norm is a rule of behavior such that individuals prefer to conform to it on the condition that they have two different beliefs. Jonathan put these in the chat earlier. They believe that most people in their reference network conform to it. That's their empirical expectation. They're just prediction about what's going to happen. But also a second kind of belief, and this is a metacognitive belief, or perhaps representational belief that I think that Hannah was getting at in her question to Jonathan, and that is the belief that most people in their reference network believe that they ought to conform to it, right? So beliefs about other people's beliefs. So you've got rules, but you also have this very high level of cognitive capacity that's required for social norms on Bicchiari's view. We start moving away a little bit from rules with Dan Kelly's way of describing social norms when he says that often informal rules, I think he's using rules loosely here, that structure human behavior, regulating what is appropriate, required, prohibited, or permitted. And then we see this term drop out completely in Machery and Malin's account, where they describe norms as attitudes towards types of actions, emotions, thoughts, or other traits, typically shared by many members of a given group. And they do things like regulate people's behavior, thoughts, emotions, character, and so on. So these are attitudes that govern people's systems and how they act. But then they add this other thing. We don't have rules, but we have deontic concepts such as should and ought, which brings back something that looks fairly cognitively sophisticated, Jonathan's rock, perhaps. And then Jonathan himself describes norms in his paper from last year as any standard of correct or appropriate behavior. And in that paper, Jonathan was working to draw this bridge between norms at an individual level when it comes to making good and effective tools that match your model of what the tool should look like and what it should do, to social norms that comes from teaching how to make tools like that, or teaching what you've learned from an individual level, an individual normativity. And the last on this slide is that norms simply govern practices. This is Elizabeth O'Neill. They're diverse in many ways. And I think that this diversity that O'Neill is stressing here is what what we really need to never forget about when we're talking about and trying to investigate norms in animals or in humans for that matter. Norms are very diverse in a number of different ways. One way in which they're diverse is that norms can also exist without groups, right? So this was what Jonathan talked about in his paper last year and also just before. And O'Neill is also not making any reference to group action, whereas all the other accounts were referring to groups. So I wanted to start at this level of individual normativity without groups, and see how that can ground our way of understanding whether or not the cognitive capacities required for having social norms would be achievable by non-human animals. So normativity without groups at this individual level, I think we can fairly easily identify 3 different ways in which you can have normativity all by yourself, in a sense. You can have theoretical rationality in terms of following rules of inference, making inferences following disjunctive syllogism, the way Chrysippus's dog is described as doing. There are 3 paths that the rabbit might have run down. I sniff the first path and don't smell the rabbit. I sniff the second path and don't smell the rabbit. And so I run down the 3rd path without even smelling. And this sort of inferential reasoning, which we can also describe in terms of other sorts of inference patterns that, that can describe behavior, might be transitive reasoning. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then we can infer that A is greater than C, even if we haven't been explicitly taught that or experienced that before. And these sorts of behaviors that conform to theoretical rationality have been quite extensively studied in great apes. A lot of my focus here is going to be on great apes when I'm looking at the animal data, and this is not at all to suggest that this is where I think it's most likely to see these kinds of normativities. It's simply that these are the most intensively studied species on these sorts of capacities. And I am constantly calling for more research on animals outside of primates, outside of mammals, and outside of the vertebrates to get a robust understanding of the evolution of cognition. I reference here the Bolter and Cole paper in 2017, which gives a nice overview of what we've been able to establish when it comes to inferential reasoning in great apes. There continues to be discussion about whether these capacities are instantiated in something like logical reasoning using predicate logic or propositional logic, or if they're better understood in terms of Bayesian reasoning models or some other sorts of models. But we have pretty substantial evidence that these patterns are followed. And all the references on this page are fairly old, because my point is not to say, hey, there's this cutting edge research out there suggesting that great apes have these capacities. But no, these are pretty solidly established research programs. The second is practical rationality. Practical rationality is simply, as we've heard, engaging in means-end reasoning. And some great examples of this have to do with tool making and use, and making tools ahead of time, carrying tools to a place where you then use a tool, making tools that help you make other tools, using tools together. We see a lot of evidence of this, and in the Shoemaker volume, it's a lovely resource for anyone who's interested in learning more about the very fine details of the different sorts of tools that primates make and use. And then the third place where I think we can pretty clearly see normativity at an individual level comes from self-regulation. So self-regulation is when one has to govern one's own desires or manipulate one's own physical states in order to achieve some goal, perhaps a feeling of comfort when an individual feels an aversive emotional response. So all 3 of these are normative, I think, in ways that are familiar in philosophy. Inferences can be valid or invalid, or strong or weak. Practical rationality can be successful at achieving a goal or not. Self-regulation can be better or worse. And skills in self-regulation varies between individuals and is related to executive function. So this is, in a sense, you know, maybe the least interesting of the norm types, because as I said, they're pretty well established and maybe not what you all showed up for. And so I'm going to very shortly turn to group normativity. But before I do that, I want to tell you the story about Day Day, just to illustrate an example of what normativity on your own might look like in a 6-year-old rehabilitant orangutan. So this is a story that Anne Russin, a primatologist who's worked with this population of orangutans in Borneo, told me about. She said that she was working with Day Day, doing a do what I do imitation experiment. And this was in the 90s. So in these experiments, she would model a behavior and then observe whether the orangutan would engage in the same behavior. And Day Day was pretty good at this. So one day she decided to see how complicated she could make things and whether Day Day could imitate these more complicated behaviors. And so what she did is she had 3 dish-shaped pieces of coconut shell, right? So like bowls basically, and 3 jackfruit seeds. So they're hard, these hard kind of nuts about the size of a grape. She placed each coconut shell down in front of Day Day and then put a jackfruit seed in the first dish and then put the jackfruit seed in the second dish. And so the game, what she was wanting Day Day to do is to put the seed in the third dish as well. And instead, what Day Day did is take the seed from the second dish and put it in with the first dish, put it in with the other jackfruit seed. And Anne says that her impression was that in Day Day's mind, the seeds went together and it couldn't be seed with dish. This was Day Day's way of doing things. That wasn't socially learned and wasn't what Anne was trying to teach her, but was a rule in a sense that she was following for herself. So moving on then to group normativity, we can see that there are the kind of 2 clusters of areas in which normativity plays a role once you get beyond an individual level. And I want to talk first about this area of normativity in communication and agreements, which obviously go together because agreements work best when they're actually communicated with your partner. And there's been also quite a bit of work on communication in non-human animals. Some of the more recent work in great ape communication has shown that there's quite a significant repertoire of gestural communication, and that some of these are shared across groups of the same species. Some of these, including some of these behaviors described in the slide here, appear to be shared between species as well, seen both in chimpanzees and bonobos. But then other communicative signals vary from group to group and have to be socially learned. So this would be something like chewing on a leaf, clipping a leaf in order to indicate sexual interest, or the hand clasp grooming that you see in some chimpanzee communities, indicating relaxed willingness to groom. And here we'll move away from primates for a minute and show that this is also seen in more familiar species, familiar to us. And Franz showed us earlier that lovely video of the dog handicapping himself to play with a really tiny dog. That was one form of communication. This is another form of communication, the play bow, which is thought to signal to a play partner that the activity that's going on is not aggressive, but is being done in a playful format. I also think that some of the really wonderful work that Franz has done in his career on reconciliation, as he highlighted in his own talk, is a really nice example of agreement. He described it as repair, which is another way of looking at it, which I really like. But agreement is a kind of repair. I mean, reconciliation as agreement is a kind of dyadic repair, right? It's the repairing of the relationship. And the agreement there is that, yeah, we're not going to fight anymore. Like, I'm done fighting, and I'm signaling to you that our next encounters are going to be friendly and not aggressive. So these are also, I think, fairly well established and don't require a lot of debate, that these behaviors exist and that they have these sorts of aspects of normativity in them that doesn't perhaps raise some of the same questions that gets raised once we turn to this last set of kinds of norms in group normativity. So, and these are social norms and moral norms. So let's go back to social norms. I said that Elizabeth O'Neill suggested that norms are diverse in many respects. And I want to highlight this again, that social norms for humans are not a homogeneous class. These are on the slide a list of kinds of norms that have appeared in the philosophical literature, coupled with some other norms that I think are important to put on the table next to them. So David Lewis, in his work on convention, had the famous callback norm. This is a dyadic norm. It's a norm that exists between groups of individuals, two people, that if we're talking on the phone and we're disconnected, the person who made the call will call back. This is social in a dyad. There's high compliance in the dyad. But interestingly, there's not conformity in this case, right? So sometimes social norms, and some of the descriptions of social norms, it was behaviors that are very common in this group. And in this example, it's the pattern that's common, but it's not particularly the behavior that's common, right? If everyone just called back, then the goal would not be achieved. So it's important to recognize that there's a distinction between conformity and norm following in humans. And we should expect, if we're going to find norms in non-human animals, that there might be similar distinctions. Another famous case of social norms discussed by Margaret Gilbert is that there's a rule we should wear fancy dress at the department meetings, but I'm going to flout it. And a number of people flout it, so it's okay. So there's this norm, it's expected, this is what one does. Perhaps this is what one used to do more often. And the younger faculty members don't do it as often. But at what point do we have a norm with low compliance? And at what point do we not have a norm anymore? Right, so that norms are not just a question of perhaps how common the behavior is in the community. A norm might be very strong even with quite low compliance for a variety of reasons. Like, for example, and this one's from Southwood and Erickson, we should vouvoyer our betters, but nobody does that, at least around here. Right, so if there's norms that no one follows anymore, in what sense is this still a norm? Well, it's a sense in that it's discussed as a norm in the human community. Then Southwood and Erickson again discuss public nudity, right? So wearing clothes is a norm that is followed by, I believe, all of us. Many humans follow the wearing clothes norm. We wear clothes except at the nudist beach, Southwood and Erickson, as they put it. And we have almost complete compliance in those kinds of societies. And this is something that everybody does. There aren't really differences here exactly. We wear clothing according to, right, what we're allowed to show and what we're not allowed to show based on gender norms or religious commitments and things like that. And then I think that all of these are norms that I think that we would all pretty well have no problem telling people. If we were to meet somebody who was entering into our community, we could tell them about these sorts of norms that we have. They're quite overt norms. But then there are also norms that I think are a bit more implicit. And so if you have a greeting norm in your community, like a greeting by hug, and there's very high compliance to this norm, there might be a number of different attitudes about the behavior, about the norm. One might hate it, and it's very obvious, and they just do it because everyone else does it. Someone might really enjoy it, and so they are noticed that they're getting to hug people a lot. But in other cases, hugging is just something that is part of the fabric, the background, and isn't even noticed, and might not be noticed unless someone came in and said, oh, I really hate hugging, it's so aversive. And then the person might say, oh, we hug? Oh, I didn't even know, right? That this was just part of the, part of the way the world is that I hadn't noticed. Other norms like this are personal space zones. You might not even know you had this until it gets violated. So these sorts of norms could perhaps be quite opaque. And making mote is another norm that Joseph Henrich discusses in The Secret to Flower Success, which is opaque in the sense that individuals don't know why they do it, but they know that they do it. They put ash in the mote when they're making it. And when he asks, why do you do that? The answer is, it's our custom. So you compare that to a Balinese new moon ceremony where there are complex offerings and prayers. Everyone is supposed to participate and do something different. This is quite a homogeneous, quite a pluralistic class of practices in many different dimensions, in dimensions of avowal and scrutiny and automaticity, in dimensions of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations to comply, and in the dimensions of how easy or hard it is to achieve, or how coarse versus how fine detailed you have to be in order to comply. And this diversity of social norms makes it quite difficult for us to really settle, I think, on a definition of the explanandum that we're looking for when we're asking whether animals have social norms. So I want to put the Mastery and Malin definition back up on the screen, because I think in a sense, they're capturing an account of social norms that is going to be perhaps most congenial to the diverse range of capacities, the diverse range of practices that gets categorized as social norms. But I want to highlight a couple of things, and one is that the attitude towards actions might not always be there on the sorts of examples I've given. We might not have an attitude towards norm compliance to the norms that we didn't realize we had, like talking distance or greeting norms, if we didn't even notice them. We might only have an attitude towards norm violation in this case. And then shared by many members of a group is the other point to highlight. Some group members might violate norms and start new ones, and they in fact might gain dominant status in that environment for shunning the old norms and doing the hip new thing that everyone else wants to do. And of course, some norms require different individuals to do different things, like in Lewis's calling back norm. So rather than understanding norms in terms of percentages of compliance or conformity to a certain behavior, to a certain action, I think we can think of this in terms of robust patterns in a society. And then the third thing I want to highlight, which we'll have to come back to, is deontic concepts. And these are questions about content. So in order to try to accommodate the diversity of norms that I saw in human environments, I was looking at the account given by Christina Bicchiari and realizing that this is something that doesn't accommodate all of the human norms that we have, particularly because I don't think that we're using theory of mind when we're doing all of our norm cognition. And so this animal social norms that I proposed a couple years ago was supposed to give a bit of a middle ground account of what a norm is, right? Walking Jonathan's tightrope between the whirlpool and the rock. So here I say there's a pattern of behavior in place, and individuals choose to conform to that pattern of behavior, and that individuals expect that others in their community will also conform, and they'll sanction those who don't conform. And so again, today, 2 years later, I have a few worries about this account, that it also only picks up a segment of what we're talking about when we're talking about social norms. Conformity isn't quite right here, and sanction isn't quite right here. It's not just responding to violations of the pattern. And this is because some of the strongest norms are those that are rarely violated, such as wearing of clothes during public lectures. That norm, I've never seen that one violated, but it's clearly a norm. And so the concept that I'm working with now was developed by myself and Evan Westra, who I'm happy to announce has just accepted a job at Purdue. And this is looking instead at normative regularities. Normative regularities are socially maintained patterns of behavioral conformity within a community. And we introduced normative regularities as a means to get at the explanandum for research in norm psychology. So normative regularities here are, just briefly, are best understood as a sort of functional category along the lines of Dennett's real patterns. Identifying the real pattern that is a community's social norm is going to be robustly predictive. It can be recognizable without knowing the psychological mechanisms that cause humans to act in the way that they need to for the pattern to emerge. And it offers a compact description of a large set of behaviors that facilitates fluent social interaction. And I guess the only other thing I want to say about this is that the idea of, here we go. The idea of normative regularity that's quite important is this idea of social maintenance, which takes the place of sanction. So social maintenance can be negative reinforcement like punishment, but it can also be positive reinforcement that's quite explicit. It can be pedagogical as well, in teaching not just the young how to act in ways you ought to act around here, but in norm violators, as in acts of restorative justice. But it also can be understood in terms of acquiring fluency in your environment, that your movement in your social world is going to be more fluent and relaxed if you're acting in ways that are corresponding with the pattern of the society that you're in. So I will not be able to spend much time on these, but there are a host of candidate animal social norms that we've identified in chimpanzees. I've discussed some of these in that 2020 paper, and I'm working with a group of people, some of whom are in this virtual room right now, about testing whether we can see evidence of normative regularities in chimpanzees. Some examples would be social prohibition of infanticide. This is certainly work Judith Burkhardt and Carl Van Schaik had been involved in, but also in cases of intergroup conflicts, and when chimpanzees patrol territory boundaries and expand their territories, and they kill and castrate males, kill infants, and kidnap females from neighboring groups. Nishida has a very evocative description about chimpanzees' understanding of outgroup members and the effective response that they have to outgroups. But what's particularly interesting is that chimpanzees immigrate. And so who was an outgroup member before becomes an in-group member now. And some of the behavioral changes that happen alongside immigration, I think, is one of the most interesting places to look for social normativity. So this is a picture of vervet monkeys. This is not great apes, but I love this study by Erica van der Waal on the social learning of a particular behavior in a community that flips completely when the individual moves to another community and they engage in another behavior around there. So when pink corn eaters immigrate to blue corn eating communities, they all change to eat the blue corn, except for the one guy who immediately became the alpha. There's also evidence of this sort of behavior in chimpanzees, that you have chimpanzee immigrants, females, who give up using hammers that are more effective in order to conform to the behavior of their new group using less effective hammers. The corn case is so great because you should clearly, from a purely biological point of view, eat the food that nobody's competing you for, right? You get all the calories to yourself, but instead you give that up to fit in with the group. So that's social norms, and some suggestive evidence, I think, that we will find social norms in non-human animals. But the question of moral norms is one that I think is not one that's productive to really engage with right now, because every time I try to engage with this, I get questions like, well, but do the animals have the right sentiments? Do they have good character? Do they act to improve their character? Most of the time, though, I get asked questions about whether they're scrutinizing their reasons for action or acting from the categorical imperative. Different accounts of what is moral normativity and moral agency is going to answer the question very differently. And perhaps we should let the ethicists do some more work with that, or collaborate with scientists in order to answer these questions in a way that would be satisfying to them. So I'm leaving that to the side. I just want to end by coming back to this worry about whether finding evidence of normative regularities in animals is going to be evidence of animal normativity, because we might still wonder whether animals have rules with deontic content, as many of the accounts and descriptions of social norms seem to require. Now, there are at least two ways of thinking of rules. We can think of rules as cognitive representations, or something having to do with mental content, if you don't like representations, another form of mental content, or vehicles of thought. Or you could think of rules as metaphysical constructs that establish meaning. And the way I think of rules, and the way I'll briefly discuss rules, is as these kind of cognitive mental content account. So I think that the normativity without groups, this individual level normativity, sets the groundwork for social normativity, because these capacities for inferential reasoning, practical reasoning, means-end reasoning, planning, self-regulation are an existence proof for animal normativity. And if animals have normativity, then they're in the space of deontic reason. Then if we combine that with an acceptance of animal beliefs, which I think at this point is fairly well, something that's very well accepted by many philosophers and by researchers in animal cognition, I think that we can get from there to a way of understanding animals as having rules in this sense. So beliefs on a traditional account coupled with desires lead to actions, ceteris paribus, right? All else being equal. And of course, evidence of animal belief comes from animal action. Being able to explain animal behavior in terms of their beliefs and desires, right? Which is what gives me evidence for the existence of their beliefs and desires, requires that we also describe the animals as implementing general rules. Namely, that their beliefs coupled with appropriate desires entail particular actions, or as Dennett puts it in Intentional Systems, it tells us what the animals ought to do. That the beliefs and desires pair on their own do nothing in order to explain behavior without these general rules. This is in fact why folk psychology as a theory gripped so many people for so long. And this functional approach to mind, as introduced by Lewis and adopted widely by both instrumentalists like Dennett and realists like Fodor, is this idea that the mind works by following rules that tell agents what to do when they have particular sets of informational and motivational states. Now, of course, these rules may be for the system, merely countenanced rather than endorsed, right, might exist at a first order level rather than endorsed or raising to a point of conscious awareness. And this is true of some human social norms. For example, in societies where there are implicitly sexist or racist patterns, at the same time that there's explicit anti-racist endorsements. And then if you even aren't willing to go so far as animal beliefs, but are more fond of saying we've got something like Millikan's push me, pull you representations, from those we already get two oughts, right? So Millikan gives us these cases as a kind of a representation that's both descriptive and directive. And an animal alarm cry would be a primary example of this. It tells you both that there's a snake up there and that you should look out for a snake. As directives, they're imperative, and imperatives have deontic structure. They command or prohibit actions. So I think that whether grounded in beliefs or more primitive states, what we are forced to see is that cognitive agency is normative agency. And that's the slogan, right? That's the slogan of this talk. And so the take home is that norm cognition can be cognitively simple, with rules countenanced and representations having deontic structure. And given its ease to achieve, we can hypothesize that it would be found widely in the animal kingdom, managing relevant aspects of animals' lives. And we can further hypothesize that social cognitive animals will have norms governing their social interactions, social norms. And so we can empirically investigate the existence and contents of social norms across species. Thank you.